The world responds to the terror in Orlando.
This is a devastating attack on all Americans.
Tonight, we learn more about the suspect, the victims, and the investigation. Making waves on the campaign trail, the mass shooting prompts calls for gun control and tighter homeland security. Violence condemned. Faith leaders, including the Pope, decry the bloodshed. And later, more than statistics. Pope Francis challenges us to put a face on hunger. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Monday, June 13th, 2016. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. Federal investigators believe the suspect in the Orlando nightclub shooting acted on his own. It's considered the worst mass shooting in modern U.S. history. Updated figures show 49 people were killed, 53 were injured, many critically. Our team coverage tonight includes Lauren Ashburn with reaction from the president and presidential candidates. Jason Calvi reports from Capitol Hill, where lawmakers are responding tonight. And Wyatt Goolsby shares messages from the Christian community. But first, the latest on the investigation. Investigators blamed the attack on 29-year-old Omar Mateen. They say he pledged his support to ISIS and apparently harbored hatred to gays, perhaps explaining why he targeted a gay nightclub. The Orlando police chief says an officer working security and others responding tried to stop the gunman, but he was killed only after a SWAT team moved in hours later and knocked a hole in the wall.
We were able to rescue dozens and dozens of people that came out of that hole. The suspect came out of that hole himself, armed with a handgun and a long gun, engaged in a gun battle with officers where he was ultimately killed.
The head of the FBI says Mateen was radicalized. He actually talked to police on the phone 3 times during the hours-long attack.
He said he was doing this for the leader of ISIL, who he named and pledged loyalty to, but he also appeared to claim solidarity with the perpetrators of the Boston Marathon bombing and solidarity with a Florida man who died as a suicide bomber in Syria for al-Nusra Front, a group in conflict with the so-called Islamic State.
Federal agents say Mateen had 2 guns on him and another in his car. They say he bought his guns legally, even though the FBI questioned him on 3 separate occasions in the past about alleged terror connections and threats. And we're learning more about the suspect tonight. Omar Mateen was a security guard who once dreamed of becoming a police officer. He attended evening prayer services at Orlando's Islamic Center 3 to 4 times a week, most recently with his young son. We haven't heard from his wife, but his ex-wife describes him as bipolar, mentally unstable, and mentally ill. She says her family helped her escape from an abusive relationship.
A few months after we were married, I saw his instability, and I saw that he was bipolar and he would get mad out of nowhere. That's when I started worrying about my safety.
The suspect was born and raised in the United States. His father, from Afghanistan, is considered a Taliban sympathizer, but he denies any knowledge of the shooting beforehand.
I don't know why he did what he did. I wasn't aware of it, and I'm very sorry and I'm very upset that he did what he did inside the United States.
Survivors describe the terror and what they did to survive. Some say they played dead. Others managed to escape out a back door. Family members share some of their stories.
He got shot. He threw himself at the floor. Then he got shot again when the gunman came over, and he said kind of lifted up his eyes a little and then just lay back down. That's when he noticed that the girl he was holding hands with all of a sudden let his hands go. But he noticed she got shot and she didn't make it.
Family members embrace each other, waiting to learn more about the fate of the victims. Dozens of names and pictures have already been released. We're learning more about the victims as this investigation unfolds. Unfortunately, the death toll may continue to rise. Doctors say some of the survivors are in grave condition. President Obama and presidential nominees cite failed policies as partly to blame for this attack. Chief White House correspondent and political director Lauren Ashburn has more tonight.
Brian, President Obama called the attack on all of us. In 2 statements since the shooting, he and presumptive nominee Hillary Clinton have urged tighter restrictions on guns, while Donald Trump has called for the president's resignation. As Orlando mourns the 49 people slaughtered, the president portrays the killer as an apparent homegrown extremist.
This is certainly an example of the kind of homegrown extremism that all of us have been so concerned about for a very long time.
And both presumptive nominees used the attack to score political points. For Hillary Clinton, it was a time to reiterate her call for keeping weapons of war off America's streets.
It's essential that we stop terrorists from getting the tools they need to carry out the attacks. If the FBI is watching you for suspected terrorist links, you shouldn't be able to just go buy a gun with no questions asked.
For Donald Trump, the mass shooting was a moment to redouble his call for tougher action against terrorism.
The Obama administration, with the support of Hillary Clinton and others, has also damaged our security by restraining our intelligence gathering, and we have just no intelligence gathering information. We need a new leader. We need a new leader fast.
The White House says Congress has failed to pass gun laws, like a ban on the no-fly list and assault weapons. But when questioned, Josh Earnest denied blaming anyone.
I don't think that there's anything that I've said here today that blames members of Congress for the terrible tragedy that occurred. But I do think that we can, and in fact should have, a detailed consideration of what policies we're going to pursue as a country that prevent that kind of violence.
The blame game doesn't stop on the presidential level. Jason Calvi joins us from Capitol Hill. Jason.
Lauren, the Senate chaplain did pray for the victims on the Senate floor today. That was then followed by a moment of silence. But as you mentioned, controversy is erupting here at the Capitol. Senate Democrats say they want to force a vote on a measure that would ban people on the terror watch list from being able to buy guns. Moments ago, however, people gathered on those steps to remember the victims of the worst mass shooting in American history.
It's radical Islam inspired by ISIS, period.
Florida's senators say the war on terror has come to Orlando.
This radical Islamic terror, we see what they do to people they accuse of being gay, to throw them off buildings and things of this nature. There is no doubt in my mind that the community was targeted in particular as a part of this overall plot to kill Americans. And if they happen to be gay or lesbian Americans, I think it added to the sick mind of this individual that carried this out.
As the country mourns the dead, Democrats take aim at guns.
I feel very strongly that Congress has a very active role in this issue, and that is, at the very least, to have a hearing to discuss high-power automatic weapons in our communities.
And tonight, activists plead with Congress.
Congress can and must do more to keep guns out of dangerous hands. People we all agree shouldn't have guns, including terrorists.
Laws allow most people who aren't felons to buy guns. But Republicans like South Carolina's Joe Wilson slam stricter gun laws.
That's ridiculous because we already know that in France they have perfect gun laws. Nobody can have a gun. And they lost 130 people in their attack. And so it's not gun laws that are a problem. They will get guns. But I see guns as protection for the American people from lone wolf attacks. It's more important today, the Second Amendment, than ever before.
Senator Marco Rubio isn't seeking re-election to the Senate this year, but he was asked if this shooting makes him reconsider. He says he is reconsidering his service to the country, but he does add, Brian, that his family's plans do not include him seeking re-election to the Senate.
Jason Calvi on Capitol Hill. Thank you, Jason. And Pope Francis is shaken and saddened by that massacre in Orlando. The Vatican says the Holy Father is expressing his deepest feelings of horror and condemnation. Wyatt Goolsby is in our newsroom with that reaction. Wyatt?
Brian, Vatican spokesman Father Federico Lombardi says the Pope strongly condemns the attack, calling it, quote, homicidal folly and senseless hatred.
Pope Francis urges prayer, saying he joins the families of victims in offering up their suffering to the Lord. Archbishop Joseph Kurtz, president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, echoed similar words, saying, quote, the merciful love of Christ calls us to solidarity with the suffering and to ever greater resolve in protecting the life and dignity of every person.
We could just pause, pray, and reflect for a moment.
Pro-lifers on Capitol Hill rallying for the unborn, taking a break from their cause to advocate for the lives lost in Orlando.
There are still people fighting for their lives. There are still people in Orlando hospitals who are on the borderline between life and death. We can pray.
But some are dismissing calls to prayer. In a tweet, one American Civil Liberties Union lawyer blamed the Christian right for the attack, saying, "You know what is gross? Your thoughts and prayers and Islamophobia after you created this anti-queer climate." Reverend Patrick Mahoney says Americans should reject the political rhetoric.
The last thing we need is to let the tragedy of terrorism and violent extremism splinter us and divide us.
Kirsten Evans is with In Defense of Christians, a group that advocates for persecuted Christians in the Middle East. Evans says we can't lose sight of the real problem, a radical ideology.
It definitely is not just a Middle East problem. They have been very clear from the beginning. This is, in their mind, a worldwide conquest, right? This is a jihad that has no boundaries.
Evans says people of faith should pray for an end to violent extremism. And Father Lombardi also says the Pope prays for people around the world to be able to prevent attacks like these in the future and to be able to better identify potential future threats. Brian.
Thank you. Austin Ruse is the president of the Center for Family and Human Rights, or CFAM. Clare Lopez, former CIA officer, vice president for research for the analysis for the Center for Security Policy. So, Clare, this gunman had been on the FBI's radar. How was he able to buy these guns and carry this attack out?
Well, when he was questioned by the FBI several years ago, 2 times, they concluded that there was nothing further to investigate, and the FBI closed the investigation. He had been in contact with a couple of other jihadis, one of whom went on subsequently to blow himself up over in the Middle East. But the FBI closed the investigation, and therefore there was no reason to detain him, and his name was not on any list when he went to buy these weapons.
It's frightening. Condemnation from religious leaders, including Pope Francis. Is there anything more we can do than condemn these attacks?
Well, the best thing I heard today was, funny enough, from the Daily Beast, who listed the names of all the victims. And someone suggested that we pray for the victims by name. And that is probably a very good idea. The first response of Christians is to pray. The second response ought to be self-defense and the defense of the innocent. People should be learning how to spot how these people when they pop up. There were warnings in San Bernardino. There were warnings with this gentleman, and people should be making phone calls, and they should be learning how to protect themselves. We should pray, defend ourselves, and defend the innocent.
We are all feeling very vulnerable right now. Can anyone protect us from this homegrown terrorism? Is there any way to do that?
Well, I would rephrase it just a little bit. This is neither homegrown nor are we really fighting terrorism. This is a global Islamic jihad. The forces of jihad is what is coming against us. So it's not homegrown at all. It is global. And I submit that we are not fighting terrorism either. We are fighting to live free of Sharia. We are fighting to live under our Constitution, if that is what we as Americans here choose to do. So to do that, we need to name this enemy very explicitly. This is Islamic. It is Islamic jihad. These are Muslim terrorists. And then formulate a proper strategy, beginning at the highest levels of U.S. national security, including the FBI and Homeland Security, to counter that.
And Austin, because this was a gay nightclub, there are people out there that are saying that Christians, for their beliefs, share some of the blame for this attack. How do you respond?
It is an odious charge. It is political opportunism of the highest order, and it should be condemned by everyone. But it's happening all over the place, happening in the mainstream media. The head of the Human Rights Campaign said it this afternoon that he learned it in church on Sunday. He's a Muslim. He does not go to church on Sunday. So it is all over the place. And people should not forget that Christians are being brutalized by these people to an extent far more than 50 people who died yesterday in Orlando. They are wiping out Christian civilization in the Middle East. They are decapitating people. They are throwing gays off of buildings. We are now in lockstep, I hope, with our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters who understand that the real threat is Islamic extremism.
Austin Ruse and Clare Lopez, thank you both for being with us. And people around vigils in memory of the Orlando nightclub shooting victims. We've seen an outpouring of support from dozens of countries. The Australian Prime Minister calls the mass shooting an attack on all of us. People in South Korea also gather for a candlelight vigil. Bishop John Noonan joining us by Skype from Orlando. Your Excellency, your community has been shattered by this tragedy. Our prayers are with you. And as shepherd of this diocese, what is your message to all of us from around the world who are seeing this now?
Well, first of all, I thank all the people who have sent us prayers and condolences. You know, it's really a heart-warming effect to have so many people call you from all over the world. It is really, it has wrenched our whole community. It's a heartfelt, moment where we're in shock. I think that's the only thing I can tell you right now.
And what is the diocese doing in terms of outreach to the people in Orlando?
Well, I must say our priests, our deacons, and our Catholic Charities have kind of gone out to all the victims and their families and helping with whatever way we can. We're adding any kind of resources, especially because a number of these victims were Spanish speaking, so we're reaching out to them with some of our bilingual faculty and staff and priests and deacons to just show and care for them at this moment, which is such a shock to them.
I'm sure that you've heard this before, Your Excellency. Why would God allow such suffering? Is there any answer that you could give?
I don't have an answer for the pain and suffering. I just prayed as I was coming back this morning on the plane. I thought about Christ even. My God, why have you forsaken me? We're all feeling that pain. And again, in the scriptures, Jesus wept at the sight of Lazarus, his friend. There are many moments in our lives when we feel pain and sorrow. We question God's role in all this. But I think ultimately we only trust in God. It's not our ways, but God's ways and it's God's mercy that we're really, truly entrusting our lives to at this moment.
And tell us about the vigil to dry tears that you have planned there.
Well, the first thing we did was to care for the people. Now we need to pray with them and to reassure them that God is with us at this time. And it's only with faith and hope and love. And as Pope Francis tells us, unless we accompany our people in their moments of pain and suffering, that we truly can bring Christ to them. And hopefully during these next few weeks and months and maybe years ahead that we can at least help them heal from this tragic loss of life.
Bishop John Noonan joining us by Skype from Orlando. Your Excellency, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Coming up, personalizing hunger. Pope Francis is passionate to help those who don't have enough to eat. And lifting up the sick and disabled, a special mass of healing. Pope Francis celebrates Mass Sunday dedicated to people with disabilities and their caregivers gathered in St. Peter's Square. The Holy Father denounced the pursuit of perfect bodies, saying such obsession leads to society hiding away those with disabilities. Thank you for joining us this Monday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. Pope Francis becomes the first leader of the Roman Catholic Church to visit the Rome headquarters of the United Nations World Food Program. Supporting the Zero Hunger campaign, the Pope says we need to stop seeing the hungry as a mere statistic. Instead, we need to see people with faces. Mary Shovlain reports from Rome.
Pope Francis crossed the city to deliver a message to the world. He said with today's information overload, we risk becoming desensitized to the suffering of others. And he pointed out how in many parts of the world, hunger is used as a weapon of war. The World Food Program's president and executive director welcomed the Holy Father as they opened their annual meeting here in Rome. Francis pauses at the memorial wall to pay tribute to the UN workers who have lost their lives while trying to deliver food to the hungry.
El hambre y la sed no cambian.
The Pope saying those who are suffering become just another news story, but the pain, the hunger, and the thirst remain. He also denounced the brazen and virtually absolute freedom with which weapons circulate in many parts of the world, while humanitarian assistance is often blocked at the border. The Pope greeted the many World Food Program employees on hand for the visit and in unscripted remarks thanked them for their service.
Grazie a un piccolo lavoro, a un piccolo sacrificio.
The World Food Program is the world's largest humanitarian organization, providing food for 80 million people in some 80 countries, often in dangerous conditions.
when he says to these people here in the building as well as to our people out in the field, you are courageous, you perform action. That is the kind of injection of adrenaline that a staff like this needs to keep performing the work in some of the toughest places around the world.
Francis ended his visit asking for prayers in the hopes that hunger and poverty will no longer have a prayer for survival. In Rome, Mary Shovlain, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Mary. And Pope Francis meets for a second time with the mother of a man who's been on death row in Texas for 2 decades. The Vatican announced the meeting Saturday between Francis and Lydia Guerrero of Argentina, but gave no details. Guerrero admits her son is guilty of murder, but says he's been driven insane during his time on death row and has already paid for his crime. Up next, pro-life activists descend on Capitol Hill. And Stephanie Gray of Love Unleashes Life discusses threats facing Canada's pro-life culture. Today is the memorial of St. Anthony of Padua, often invoked to find lost items. This Franciscan priest was known as the Hammer of Heretics for his powerful preaching. St. Anthony, pray for us. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick, and pro-life activists warn lawmakers about a late-term abortionist set to speak before Congress. They call his abortion practices brutal and unsafe. Some at today's Capitol Hill rally are from Germantown, Maryland, where Dr. Leroy Carhart runs a clinic. He is supposed to give a deposition to a House panel investigating the sale of aborted baby parts. Pro-life activists say he has performed abortions on women up to 8 months pregnant. Carhart's deposition, scheduled for today, was postponed. The Canadian Senate amends a bill to make assisted suicide even more accessible. The CBC reports lawmakers removed the near-death requirement last week. This comes just days after Canada legalized assisted suicide. Stephanie Gray, a pro-life activist from Canada, is president of the ministry Love Unleashes Life. Stephanie, give us a sense of the pro-life culture in Canada right now.
You know, we're facing a very challenging time in Canada because our government is moving towards making a law that would allow for assisted suicide and euthanasia. And unfortunately, a majority of Canadians are moving towards accepting this idea that maybe under certain circumstances, it's okay to end someone's life, which we shouldn't be really surprised about because Canada has a long history of widespread access to abortion where we have unrestricted access to abortion. It's paid for by our tax dollars and can happen through all 9 months of pregnancy. So we are living in a culture of death and it's only getting worse.
Do you see this bill that's being considered having any kind of an impact on the U.S.?
Well, I think like anything, it certainly could. Already some American states do have assisted suicide and euthanasia, but only a handful, whereas in Canada, what's going to happen is it would be accessible across the whole country. So that could influence more states wanting to have the same kind of widespread national access the way people would have in Canada.
How do you respond to people who say this bill doesn't even go far enough because people say with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's can't make this decision in advance?
I would say a civil society doesn't kill. So instead of saying the bill doesn't go far enough, we should say the bill shouldn't happen at all, that what we need is a law that clearly condemns killing, that clearly condemns allowing someone to have assistance with their lives being intentionally ended. We're not talking about someone naturally dying at the end of their life. We're talking about another party assisting in their suicide in a country that's battling suicide right now. We have a problem in Attawaskapat, which is a First Nations reserve, where young people have attempted suicide. In Woodstock, Ontario, there have been 5 suicides amongst teenagers in 5 months. So on one hand, our Canadian media is saying, this is horrible, all these suicides are happening. The media is crying out about that. And yet the same media is saying, hey, we're about to have assisted suicide and this seems reasonable. It's crazy.
And you call this attack on the medical profession. Why?
Well, if you look at the Hippocratic tradition, Hippocrates, the Oath of Hippocrates, that was designed to really have a standard that separated the physician as a sorcerer from a physician as a healer, and to basically say physicians aren't sorcerers, they're not killers, they're healers. But what this is doing is attacking that standard and basically putting healers into the profession of also being killers. And that's very dangerous because how then can we trust our physicians?
Stephanie Gray with Love Unleashes Life. Thank you for being here, Stephanie.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us tonight. For the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. Good night. God bless.